The cause-effect relationship of tipping practices concerning organizational motivation, organizational self-esteem, organizational commitment, and citizenship behavior, as presented by the researcher Grayson Jamrock. This study was created to examine the manners in which tipping policies and procedures might positively or negatively impact a working environment from the viewpoint of the application of citizenship behavior. Currently, no similar studies exist. Ones observing comparable data either use differing viewpoints, examine alternate audiences, or are simply out of date. The purpose for the study is to gain a better understanding of how tipping culture impacts affected employees and use this information to determine ideal leadership styles and managerial courses of action for future employers and employees. In this study, we will create a comprehensive examination and analysis of data. We will determine conclusions from existing data and new data combined together. We will create a foundation of information for future studies, and we will correct previous misinterpretations. Tipping is a practice that has had significant relevance within the United States for many centuries, and while the application of the process is common, the manner in which tips are collected, applied, and viewed significantly differs from place to place, which in turn alters the manner in which it impacts workplaces and the persons therein. In 1977, Yori Ben-Zion and Eddie Carney calculated a model in which a customer chose the tip they wished to leave and demanded the effort level they expected, while the server determined how many hours to work and what level of effort to supply, the equilibrium of which defined the point of supply being equal to demand. This suggests that tipping has remained in place and successful for so long because it allows the customer to define the transaction taking place. They are in a unique position to evaluate and experience the server's work, and therefore more qualified to reward it as seen fit. John Sider and Terry Weger found that servers who directly complimented their parties on their choice of food received significantly higher tips, and more often. Ofer Azar and Israel found that many Americans cited their reason for tipping even out of country was that it was a social norm within their home country and an ingrained behavior. Edward Mansfield developed upon this and stated that tips are frequently regarded as a means to compensate workers who earn low wages and toil in relatively poor working conditions, which suggests that these factors influence the size of gratuities and the commonplace manner in which they are received. The primary driver of this study is organizational citizenship behavior, which has also been described as good soldier syndrome. It consists of behavior that an employee demonstrates towards their job, including voluntary, innovative, and spontaneous behavior that benefits the employer and/or organization without necessarily benefiting the employee. It's widely considered to be the sum of a greater amalgamation of other concepts feeding into it, and while there are a tremendous number of evaluator methods, for the purpose of this research, we will be focusing on those that most deftly organize and impact organizational behavior. These will be classified as organizational motivation, organizational self-esteem, organizational commitment, and attitude towards tipping. Now, while a number of research articles were consulted, quickly summarized, organizational motivation was defined by Gary Vanden Bosch as the desire or willingness to make an effort in one's work and workplace. Organizational-based self-esteem was defined by Morris Rosenberg, building off of self-esteem, which is the overall evaluation of one's competencies, and Abraham Corman further developed this into his theory of working self-esteem, or organizational self-esteem, which centered around the idea that an individual's self-esteem was formed within work and organizational experiences and played a significant role in determining employee motivation and work-related attitudes and behaviors. Organizational commitment is widely seen as an attitude towards an organization that gives an employee their willingness, energy, and loyalty to act in a favorable manner for both the organization and themselves. It is a phenomenon widely recognized as a relationship betwixt employee and employer, though some researchers, such as Lawrence Rebniak, view it as strictly transactional, while others, such as Yao Schweiner and Arthur Geckman, classify organizational commitment as a one-sided bet that is linked with extraneous, consistent activities over a period of time. All of these concepts, figured together, feed into the idea of organizational citizenship behavior and were considered heavily by the researcher when she developed the following hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. There is a positive relationship between organizational motivation and organizational citizenship behavior. Hypothesis 2. There is a positive relationship between organizational self-esteem and organizational citizenship behavior. Hypothesis 3. There is a positive relationship between organizational commitment and organizational citizenship behavior. Hypothesis 4. There is a positive relationship between the perception of wages within an organization and organizational citizenship behavior. For the purposes of this research, a positive relationship is denoted as the manner in which one variable impacts another variable. Summarized, this means that as organizational motivation, organizational self-esteem, or organizational commitment increase, so too does the output of organizational citizenship behavior. We see this represented in the following model. As you will see presented in this slide, citizenship behavior is denoted as the dependent variable centered between the independent variables of organizational motivation, organizational self-esteem, organizational commitment, and attitude towards tipping. Now, in consulting data for this research, the author did find that there were a number of studies that proved that organizational motivation, self-esteem, commitment, and attitude towards tipping all intercorrelated with one another. But for the purpose of this research, we are only focusing on each respective independent variable's relationship towards the dependent variable of citizenship behavior. Organizational motivation, based on previous research, is seen as a state of being rather than a trait of being, which, as defined by Michael Christian, denotes that employees are continuously stimulated through their work in manners such that allow them to develop connections to it, thus remaining more engaged. David Harrison presents that job satisfaction is a critical predictor of turnover and absenteeism, which builds the construct that motivation is broader than arousal of effort, but also includes factors relating to the motivation to come to work and engagement within the work environment itself. Organizational-based self-esteem was reported by Garner and Pierce to have a positive relationship towards citizenship behavior, which indicated that individuals who perceive themselves to be valuable assets within their organization would often engage in behavior that said organization would value, and for which they would demonstrate appreciation. Employees that engaged in citizenship behavior as an impetus to their organizational-based self-esteem were likely to experience greater level of social status within their organization, which would increase their regular self-esteem, which would lead to them continuing to contribute greater citizenship behavior, which would correlate a cyclical nature between the concepts of organizational-based self-esteem and organizational citizenship behavior. Organizational commitment relies on the theory of collective social exchange, as developed by Peter Blau. This postulates that employees of an organization will, together, interpret their social exchange with an organization, suggesting a social contract. It is these shared perceptions that affect an employee's individual level of commitment to an organization, which affects their individual citizenship behavior, which wholly affects their collective citizenship behavior of the many employees of one organization as a singular whole. Attitude towards tipping, as a final construct, also presents links towards citizenship behavior. Richard Shull presented evidence in his 2000 equity analysis that perceptions of job equality and pay equality significantly correlated with extra roles/citizenship behavior. A study conducted in 2005 by Katherine Johnson, in which the researcher attempted to compare motivational behavior of tipped wage employees versus non-tipped wage employees, found that both motivation and organizational commitment were highly dependent within the form of casual to elite restaurants upon the determined level of managerial loyalty to their actual employees being paid. This included the concept of wages and stipends, which of course includes tips and tipped wages. The manner in which an employee perceives their pay grade to be just or even equal to coworkers does impact the behavior they exhibit towards their workplace overall on a further declining trend in a positive correlative manner. Methodology for this research conducted included a systematic literature review of previously existing data, data analysis of qualitative and quantitative data of both previously existing data and newly generated data, SPSS data extrapolation and analysis of current and previous data, and original research, which was presented in the form of a survey. This survey consisted of 53 questions, which concerned 6 key demographic questions, 10 questions concerning Kovach's motivational scale, 10 questions concerning Pierce's organizational self-esteem principles, 10 questions concerning Maudet's organizational commitment questionnaire, and 7 questions concerning Cho's tipping reduction, which was reduced from a previous study of 43 questions concerning employee benefits towards the attitude of tipping. The survey took place over 1 week in March of 2019 and was distributed to a total of 61 students at Missouri State University. Of those 61 responses, 16 had to be thrown out before being considered for analysis. 1 was submitted as incomplete. 15 did not answer the qualifying questions and were unable to be evaluated as a result of not possibly qualifying for the survey itself. The results of the survey, which are seen on the next slide, were immediate and fascinating. Using SPSS software to evaluate the prescience of the model presented by the researcher, we were able to determine a high normative level of correlation between the variables presented within the aforementioned hypotheses. While conducting analysis of the presented data, There was no apparent violation of the multivariate normity assumption in the distribution of residuals, which ensured use of the maximum likelihood theory. Goodness of fit measures were used to assess overall model fit, which resulted in a figure of r squared equaling 0.731. Adjusted r squared equaled 0.711, which allowed for the possibility of bias within the research conducted while still averaging a high percentage overall. F change equals 37.063, which demonstrated a high justification for the number of variables, of which there were 5 considered, within the research, as well as allowing for errors that might have been made in calculating the final results due to the poor implementation of the Kovac scale, which we will discuss later. The results of this testing constitute that the model presented earlier within the slideshow are accurate 73% of the time, which is a high enough correlation to be seen as valid and not so high that it requires further question insofar as that model implementation was. We will consider this a success for the results of the rest of the research. The results of this research indicated that there was a low correlation between the variables of experience and education onto the variable of perception of tipped wages. This would suggest that despite individuals having restaurant experience or restaurant education, it does not impact their attitude towards tipping overall, which leads into the second trend we noticed, that overall attitude towards tipping is empathetic, bordering on apathetic, or even just neutral. Within the subsection of attitude towards tipping, 2 scenario-esque questions were presented to survey takers that asked, depending on their current position, whether or not they would normally be willing to switch to a new position of a different pay grade, either tipped with the chances of tips being received, or minimum wage with no chances of tips being received, assuming that in the switch they received all the same benefits as their current position. The results of these questions indicated that 46.7% of participants would be willing to exchange their current position for one that offered tipped wages with the likelihood of tips, while 53.3% of participants reported that they would not change their current position for one that offered minimum wage with no chance of tips. And even within these questions, we did see a further divide regarding the demographic of gender. The consideration of gender did present a unique split in overall perceptions towards tipping attitudes. There was a trend of men being significantly more likely than women to be receptive towards tipping policies as a whole, of almost 12.13%. Even when we factored in the single unidentified score of somebody who remained gender neutral on either spectrum, males overall responded more positively towards receiving tipped wages, working for tips, and continuing the application or implementing the policy of tipping practices within their work environments. And while this research was not specifically designed to evaluate any of these parameters, numbers did indicate all of these trends to be true, which presents some following and interesting conclusions. Overall, the model as initially presented by the researcher was successfully tested and significantly proven, which denotes that organizational citizenship behavior is very significantly impacted by the intended variables of organizational commitment, organizational-based self-esteem, attitude towards tipping, and organizational motivation. Now, of these considered factors, organizational commitment held the highest level of relevance to the output of organizational citizenship behavior, suggesting that employers who are seeking employees who will export the best kind of behavior or the one that is most relevant and beneficial towards the organization would do well to seek out employees who are intending to build a long-term relationship with that employer and with that organization. This, perhaps in some way, provides justification to the interview question often asked, what are your 5-year plans? Overall, no demographics presented a high level of significance unto the testing of the original or varied models, with the exception of gender onto attitudes of tipping, as we previously explored. And finally, employees are not entirely unreceptive towards tipping policies and procedures as they currently stand. The results of this data indicated that a receptive attitude was 59.23% more likely than a non-receptive attitude towards all encapsulations of tipping procedures. This suggests that as it currently stands, tipping as an institute will be able to self-maintain further into the future, as it is backed by employees and future leaders who will be guiding the industry at some point therein. Now, in developing this research, there were of course some limitations that impacted the results we got. There was a limited survey pool of a very specific subset of people within an age and demographic, since the researcher was seeking educated and experienced restaurateurs. There was a shortened length of time to develop, execute, and analyze the data that was collected, and the wording of certain questions, including the Kovac motivational scale, would have thrown off data results, not significantly in this case, but in a larger scale sample would have altered the results quite dramatically. All of these would need to be improved before future research could be successfully developed. On a happier, more successful note, there is a lot of potential for this research to be further developed or used in the future. Some suggestions by the author might be to include a wider audience and testing sample. This would include a more diverse survey pool, perhaps international or at least national, consisting of several schools, different assessments, which would include the rewording of certain questions, and a longer duration of time in which to collect data and reanalyze it. For example, we could survey the entire state of Missouri with multiple different schools for a month and a half, building upon this previous study. The next suggestion would be to better word questions regarding the attitude towards tipping. Chose reduction was certainly an interesting sample to use and provided a lot of insightful data as demonstrated by the further trends section, but not all of it was relevant exactly to what was being sought by the researcher. In order to improve and better narrow the scope of the data we are trying to collect, it would be advisable to use perhaps the full range of tipping, resulting in a longer survey overall, but giving us more data to work with and more accurate data at that. It would also be fascinating to set up a study to inquire as to why gender is relevant to perceptions towards tipping. In preparing for this research, the author noticed a number of studies that noticed differences between tipping policies, procedures, and perceptions based on the gender of men, women, or unidentified. However, while certain attributes were found, such as men receiving larger tips overall, but women receiving more tips overall, it would be interesting to see in other ways how gender is impacted by and does impact tipping procedures and perceptions. If we can narrow the scope better, perhaps we would find a way to make tipping a more equal practice overall, receiving better perception, and ensuring a continuance of a fair sort of application. Overall, this study was insightful, impactful, and fascinating to complete. The references listed here are the ones that were most heavily consulted in the building of the survey and used in the building of this slideshow and summarizing all the data found. It was a pleasure to study and learn, and I will look forward to developing more upon this in the future. Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.